Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Ninth House, chapters 6, 7, and 8. Last fall, winter. In these chapters, we find out what happened to Alex to make her fear the Greys so much. And I will tell you what, it's a lot worse than I thought. It's a lot worse than I was expecting. The whole thing is very bad. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Joanna for commissioning this episode. I am really, I have to say, a little bit blindsided by the direction that this goes. And I don't know if I should be, because it feels like it was evident it had been some real trauma. I think I'm surprised at the choice that Leigh Bardugo has made to use sexual assault. And I'm going to sort of let go of my instinctive reaction to that and hope that there is a very specific reason for it. I think that the sort of assumption I'm making right now is that she wanted to use to create a sort of metaphor for the experience of going your whole life not being believed about a thing. And how that just completely, it just fucks everything up. It fucks up how much you trust other people. It fucks up how much you trust yourself. It fucks up your self-worth and sense of agency. It's just all around. And seeing ghosts is already very upsetting, but there is a certain violation that goes with sexual assault that I feel like isn't the same as simply being physically assaulted. And it is, I'm thinking, again, this is all theorizing on my part, what Leigh Bardugo is attempting to do here is really emphasize how much these things are invading Alex's life in every sense. So I'm going to sort of try to get over it a little bit, because you guys know this isn't something that Leigh Bardugo uses a lot, right? That's not to say that sexual assault or coerced sex or trafficking isn't part of her stories, because that's a part of the Grisha series for sure. We have the whole storyline with Genya, and then we have Inej. They are both exploited really horribly, but we don't see it. We hear about it secondhand. We find out afterward about a lot of it, and it is not in the scene. So I don't believe, I feel like Leigh Bardugo has built up enough goodwill as a writer for me to trust that there is a specific reason she's doing this the way that she is. Whereas, if this were a writer I didn't know well, or if it were a male writer, no offense, male writers, but full offense, you guys really do overuse this shit. I would have probably been pretty irritated. And as it was, I wasn't so much irritated as just genuinely oh God, this is fucked up. So all this to say, I'm going to just start from the start. Chapter 6, and this is we are at the house with Dawes, and in the last episode I've been recording saying, I don't understand why she wants to avoid Dawes. Sure, Dawes seems like kind of awkward, but she also seems like she mostly wants to be left alone, and it's probably like worth it to go over there and get a nice bath and some Sammys and, a glass of nice port or bourbon or whatever the fuck. But we find out in these chapters that the vibe she's been getting off of Dawes is the disapproval that it felt like initially, due to the fact that apparently whatever happened to Darlington, Dawes blames Alex for it. And I would like to remind you all, we still don't know what happened to Darlington, and I am dying here. The fact that Dawes blames Alex is fascinating because it feels like Alex is she is not only like connected to it, but that Dawes was involved. This is like a bigger, more public deal than I was really expecting. And by public, I mean, it's clearly not public in any sense because she's telling everybody that he's abroad in Spain, but more so that there are more people involved in it than just her and Darlington, which is sort of what I expected. And I'm wondering how many others there are and what it is about what happened that is causing them to keep it so quiet, because this is not particularly like when these societies keep things from one another, it tends to be because it's proprietary knowledge, because of whatever their subject matter is, because of pride, But something like this, I don't know. Maybe it is for pride and it's just a different thing where they're embarrassed about what happened. Anyway, I wanted to touch on this real quick too before I begin, that out of curiosity, because like I had been saying, I have toured Yale. I lived in New Haven, but the overall landscape of Yale is something that I'm only really passingly familiar with. That one tour I did 10 years ago now, longer. And I don't remember a lot of it. And I was thinking about Leigh Bardugo and probably that she must have gone to Yale herself. And when I looked it up, not only had she gone to Yale, but she was part of a secret society called Wolf's Head, which was established in 1880 something. And it was, they only all of these societies were men only up until the mid 90s, which is honestly so pathetic. But yeah, she got inducted into the Wolf's Head Society, and the buildings that they have are indeed called tombs and look as dramatic as they sound in some cases. And, the fact that Leigh Bardugo has been involved in a lot of this stuff and is writing this story for some reason just adds a real little extra something, And I'm not saying that she's I'm going to tell about all of the magic because who's going to believe me anyway? But honestly, am I not saying that because I kind of want to believe that, even though I absolutely don't want to believe that because it's horrible, but I'm just saying, maybe I believe that. Maybe a little bit. Maybe there's something. Okay, so at this point, we've got Darlington, when we start with chapter 6, who is in the midst of recovering from having taken Hiram's bullet. And he wanted some food to help him warm up, and Dawes brings him dill and salmon sandwiches, and he's just that's really, I was thinking a nice big bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup maybe, and she's yeah, we don't have that, this is what you get. And he is quizzing Alex about the history of some of these societies, who is taken more seriously than who and why. We find out about the Aurelians, which the previous chapter had ended with some quotes about Aurelians, which I didn't really get into. But basically the vibe of the Aurelian house is they're extremely practical, and what they do is of worth, but it's so lacking in glamour, really, and it's not particularly exciting. So a lot of people sort of sleep on them, and they deal with contracts. They really, the energy they give is we're the lawyer magicians, you know? And when she says people don't take them seriously because they don't have a real tomb, he says, we're not like those people though, are we? We're not snobs. And she's like, yes, you are. And he says, okay, well, granted, I'm not that kind of snob. And I have to say, I kind of admired the fact that he was immediately like, all right, I'm not even like offended or going to argue or, you know, take a moment to be surprised you said that, because it's just so fucking self-evident. So we find out that like there may have been an Aurelian assassination of Winston Churchill. He was found with like a copy of a book that had a section that wasn't published in other books. So like it may have been a problem if somebody had managed to notice and they didn't. And Aurelian was kicked out of their rooms when union contract negotiations with the university soured. The charge was serving alcohol to minors, but the fact is that Yale felt Aurelian had botched the initial contracts. They lost room 405, and their work has been shaky ever since. These days, they mostly manage the occasional non-disclosure agreement or inspiration spell. That's what we'll be seeing tonight. And, Alex is like, well, okay, but you're saying that their stuff isn't flashy and it's not particularly dangerous, so why do we even need to be there? And he says there is a lot of blood used in the ritual they're going to do, and that tends to draw grays. And when she like slows down, he says, please don't tell me you're squeamish. And then immediately is like, oh my God, I know what she's been through, like at least some of it. And I know that's not the fucking, like, that's just to act like, oh, it's just that you're squeamish and not think about the real actual trauma. It's a very different thing. And I appreciate how quickly he realizes, but he doesn't apologize or try and like backpedal at all. And part of me appreciates that. And part of me wishes he had. I'm very mixed because Alex is prickly, you know, understandably. And I almost think that if he had tried to backpedal or apologize, she would have reacted more poorly than him just sort of leaving it. But anyway, she is clearly really tense. He's trying to convince her it's going to be okay, but she doesn't look okay. And finding out sort of what wound up happening to her, I think that the blood is the connection. So we are going to have to talk about that, but I don't want to and I don't like it. But we will get there, and I am not going to do it right now. So they set up this ritual, and there's an introduction to this girl who is calling Alex the new you to Darlington. He is talking about like grave dust and all this stuff that they can use to keep grays away. And working the doors, like he's just basically sort of quizzing her about all of the key things that they can do. Greys loathed any reminder of death or dying. Lamentations, dirges, poems about grief or loss, even a particularly well-phrased mortuary ad could do the trick. I really like that. And she says, how about both? And he says, there's really no need. We won't waste power if we don't have to. She looked skeptical. Her anxiety surprised him. Alex Stern might be graceless and uneducated, but she'd shown plenty of nerve, at least when anything but moths were concerned. Where was the steel he'd glimpsed in her before, and why did her fear disappoint him so acutely? And again, Darlington, I am desperate for you to just hearken back to your self-awareness that you had a few minutes ago, because her anxiety is not about what you think it's about. And I feel like you are on the verge of understanding that. And it's in like, you're almost there, but you don't get it. And they wind up having a fight later about this. And she is right. She is right to be as angry as she is. So they have their sort of like little conversation before they get started, he's explaining some of the things that are being used in the ritual, because they have like goat skin parchment and whatnot. And he says something about how I'll be monitoring the north and west for grays. You're going to take the rest of the, and she says how you can't see them. And he takes out the drink and he has to down it before he loses his nerve, because it's genuinely fucking awful. Awful in so many senses. And we find out later it makes you incredibly cold. And that lasts for a long time, and getting cold, that it's the kind of cold that's really hard to get rid of after, because it's coming from inside you. It's not like coming from the outside in. And I love when he drinks it and says, fuck, she's like, that's the first time I heard you swear. And it says, I class profanity with declarations of love, best used sparingly and only when wholeheartedly meant. And that's one of those things that I agree with in principle, but I always wholeheartedly mean it. I always do. So it's fine. And he is just trying to keep it together, but he is trembling so bad. Compares it to getting an icicle shoved up your ass, as this girl Michelle had once said. And he thinks about how the only similar feeling he's ever had was when he very nearly died, being cut off by like a tractor trailer that came within inches of his car, and how intense this like adrenaline was. And that's the same feeling. Anyway, there's a moment here where he says, you couldn't keep sidling up to death and dipping your toe in. Eventually it grabbed your ankle and tried to pull you under. And I really liked that line, because that's what he's doing. And he is saying this in regard to the liver toxicity that can happen. But honestly, you're fucking around with trying to see death. That's different. It's not liver toxicity. Like, no, we're talking about the concept of death, the veil. And yeah, you might not be able to come back. And that's just, that feels like very literal to me. So he sees a ghost who he believes he recognizes as like somebody who is sort of important, has a moment of wishing that he could see more of them more often, but it's just so difficult to like handle this stuff, and he knows it's impossible. And he has a bit of like envy again for Alex, sort of has to cut it off because he gets that it's not reasonable. And there is a gray coming toward Alex, and she is really starting to lose it. She has a vial of graveyard dirt that she's trying to get the lid off of, and she can't get it off. And finally, Darlington, who is saying he can't hurt you, which once again, he's saying this with such confidence. And I'm like, there is no way she'd be this scared if they couldn't hurt her. Like, she hasn't told him anything, but I'm already like, I don't believe you. And it's wild that you are so sure. And finally she yells, take courage. No one is immortal. And this ghost books it away because apparently that is a poem about death. And she is staring at the place where the ghost disappeared, and is like, that was so easy. And this comes up later. Yes. So we have the start of the ritual, and what this dude is doing is like using his blood, and it like goes out onto the parchment, but then gets sucked back into his body. I am not going to get into it too deeply, but it doesn't seem pleasant for him when it starts to go back in, and he has to really focus and grab the edge of the table and hold on while he's sort of writhing and screaming because it is so painful. And this is when the grays begin to show up. And Alex, for her part, is using the graveyard dirt on the grays and really like reveling in this sense of power that she's finally like experiencing for the first time in regards to these things that she did not know she could keep away. And all of this, it looks so like joyful for a second to me, of like she's got this freedom. And then he turns around, he hears her grunt, and that's what makes him turn. And she has fallen back, and she is scrabbling backward as the Greys approach her and walk through the circle of protection. Alex had stepped on the markings and ruptured the protective circle. Now, I'm going to just asterisk here. I believe this is what happened right now, but it wouldn't be entirely surprising to find out a Grey actually smudged it or shoved her to make her smudge it. Like, this feels the kind of careless that I don't believe Alex would be when she is surrounded by these things and has the type of anxiety that she has. Whether she's feeling a surge of relief and excitement that she can control them, sure, but I don't see her getting so carried away that she just steps on the circle. Don't buy it. And she says later that one of them touched her. She doesn't get a chance to say whether it like shoved her or if it was, you know what I mean? So that isn't really part of it yet, but I am wondering a lot about this. And this is a huge problem, because if the ritual gets disrupted by these Greys, it will definitely kill the guy who's in the middle of doing the main part of the magic. And it might take half the people in this room with him, because the magic is just going to spring completely out of control, and who knows what it could do. So he and her keep trying these like scraps of poems and songs, and it is not effective. They're making them pause, but it's not enough to get them to turn and leave. And as he's realizing that this isn't doing what it needs to do, he looks outside and sees a ton of Greys. A horde was assembling, a tide visible through the glass walls surrounding the building. And finally, she begins to sing this song. And I had mentioned, I think episode 1, how she was talking about her abuela singing or speaking in Ladino. And I had never heard the term Ladino. And I looked that up also. And that is apparently a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew, which I had never heard of before ever. And I find that really fucking fascinating. But anyway, this begins to sort of work. The translation is, "The leaves are growing and turning gold. My heart beats, and my heavy heart beats and sighs. He who knows nothing of the sea knows nothing of suffering." And it seems to be helping. It's not causing them to disappear, but it's pretty bad. And there's this like wave of words that comes out of Darlington, Virgil. The wave crashed and the Greys were scattered over the stone tiles of the plaza. Darlington could see them through the glass, bobbing like chunks of ice in the moonlight. Hastily, Darlington redrew the marks of protection, strengthening them with heaps of graveyard dirt. And what he does, and I love this so much, the people doing this ceremony are really mad that these two were disrupting things, because they can't see the Greys. So they're just thinking, these guys were yelling for no fucking reason. I don't know. You know why they're here. So trust that if they're flipping out and just reciting poetry wildly, there's a fucking thing going on. But what Darlington does, and this is a thing I wish so fucking much that I could learn to weaponize, but I am not good at this, and it's genius. What he does is just when somebody comes up to him and is like, what the hell was that? He just goes, why don't you tell me? And goes on the offensive and really suggests that this all happened because of their mistake. Have you performed this ritual before in exactly this way? And he is like, well, I don't know what he had in mind, but there was a bunch of grays. You put me and Dante at risk. I'm going to have to report this. Aurelians shouldn't be tampering with forces. And then she's like, no. Things were going to get a little bit tricky, but it's okay. And Darlington again, she could have been hurt. She could have been killed. This is a donation year, isn't it? We can make sure it's a generous one. I love that she immediately goes to money because of course they fucking would. And then, are you trying to bribe me? No, not at all. A negotiation, an understanding. And he just says, get out of my sight. And I was like, no, you should have taken that money, baby. You should have. And they clean up. They walk back to Il Bastone to talk, but they don't speak on the way because it is just... that was very close and it's very clear. Darlington hasn't seen anything like that before, the horde that was gathering. So they go inside and he says, what happened? And she says, I don't know. And he says, not good enough. You are literally of no use to us if you can't handle a few grays. And she says they weren't coming at you. And he says, yeah, they were. 2 of those gates were mine to guard. And I was just like, I don't know, man. They were coming from the direction, like, it didn't feel like they were coming for you. It just didn't. They just weren't. And he is all of what, this is what happens. All of the evidence of his own eyes that they were approaching her and not him the same way is out the window because he is already so certain that things are a certain way with grays that he is refusing to see this evidence because it doesn't make sense with what he thinks he knows. So he says, you need to be ready next time. You weren't prepared. And she says, and whose fault was that? And he gets really defensive thinking that she means her training here. And it's like, I gave you books. I gave you weeks. And this is when she flips out and she takes a wine glass and throws it and says, and what about all the years before that? Where were you? All of you wise men of Lethe with your spells and your chalk and your books. Where were you when the dead were following me home, when they were barging into my classrooms, my bedroom, my damn bathtub? Sandow said you'd been tracking me for years, since I was a kid. One of you couldn't have told me how to get rid of them? That's all it would have taken. A few magic words? And he says they're harmless. They are not harmless. You talk as if you know. Like you're some kind of expert. You have no idea what they can do. Why didn't you help me? I did. You were about to be buried. Not you. Sandow, Lethe, someone. Take courage. No one is immortal. Do you know what that would have meant to me to know those words when I was a kid? It would have taken so little to change everything. But no one bothered. Not until I could be useful to you. And I wanted to applaud. I wanted to give her a steak dinner and champagne and a bubble bath. I swear to God, girl, good for you. And honestly, this is the vibe, guys. This is my entire vibe about people who have money and power, is that you don't get how little it would take from you to completely change a person's life. This is a magical situation, so this would take even less. Even less. But sincerely, like a fraction of the fortunes of the top 1% would absolutely and utterly change everyone's lives down here in the 98%. But it is seen as just an obscene thing to even ask, to expect, to anything. Like, and this is something I think about all the time with, like, if one major celebrity, name anybody that is a household name, retweeted one of my tweets about the show. Can you imagine? That would be it. I would be set for life. And they wouldn't even have to actually say anything. All they would have to do is retweet me. It wouldn't even have to be a quote tweet. And that would be it. And I'm not saying that they don't do that out of like, malice, but it's just the evidence of how little it would take. And it hurts to know that sometimes, that I can scrape and work myself into the ground for a decade, and somebody out there could just retweet me and accomplish more than that in that one gesture. I could bypass everything I have made for myself so far, and it would be left behind in the shadow. Like, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, she is dead right, and he is very uncomfortable because he knows she is absolutely correct. And we get this lovely line. He let himself think of her as someone who had made all the wrong choices and stumbled down the wrong path. It hadn't occurred to him that she was being chased. If that isn't a word, and I'm not trying to pretend that's the case for me exactly, but I think for a lot of us, that being chased, it may not be as literal as it is like being haunted by ghosts, but the specters of poverty and illness and neglect, those chase just as much. It's just the same. And he says, "Do you want to throw something else? Would it make you feel better?" And he opens up all of these cupboards, revealing all of this like priceless crystal, and just says, "Where would you like to start?" And I can't help but wonder if she does break them, or if she just decides, why don't we just load these up into a truck and sell them, and you can give me money, and that can be your reparations. Because that's really what she should be doing a lot more. She should be demanding money. Like, yeah, you got me set up at this school, but this is actually more of a chore. I'm doing you favors that you desperately need. And she's in a position of power and doesn't really seem to like want to leverage that at all. She's like afraid to fuck up her good thing. And I think she could do more with it. So then we go to chapter 7, and this is when we find out that Dawes does not blames her for whatever happened. That's as much information as we get. She goes and gets sandwiches. This is such a little thing, but I was like, she found the plate of last night's sandwiches Dawes had left covered with a damp towel on the top shelf of the fridge. Storing sandwiches under a damp towel, I'm sure, is like a kind of thing that if you were born 50 years ago instead of 40, maybe this was more common knowledge. That's genius. And I'm definitely using that. I never knew of that as a storage method, but brilliant. Otherwise they get too soggy. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so I really have to start picking up my pace. I'm sorry. She is trying to find information about speaking with the dead, about dealing with murder. Now, dealing with murder, that doesn't get her the feedback she needs. And what she does here, this library is wild. But basically, you tell the library what you need and stay outside as it shakes, and then you open the door and go in, and it has everything on the subject you requested. And she is unable to find very much on murder, but when it's speaking with the dead, it's extensive. We find out that if you don't because he's talking about the maintenance of the library and the fact that if you don't do this incantation every year, it will cause all the books in the entire collection to jump into the library at one time, and it will crush whoever is underneath because the floor will collapse. That's what happened last time. So eventually she finds a spell, and it's interesting because it involves a scarab, and it is this is something that we know another body was discovered with a scarab in his mouth in place of his tongue. Like, I think this was the very first thing that caused them to create Lethe. So that must have been what they were trying to do here. So let's see. This is when we get the story about what happened to her. So Alex is 12. And she has finally made a friend, and genuinely feeling good about things. She manages to keep a lid on everything that she sees, not let it influence things too much. Gets her mother to like start calling her Alex instead of Galaxy because it's just easier, which I really do understand. And she is able to keep her, and I love the white kids still thought she was Mexican, and the Mexican kids still thought she was white, and I was like, fucking mood, girl. But they go to this butterfly pavilion, and this is where her fear comes from, which it's so wild how this can happen, but it like really makes sense. It's just the association, the butterfly didn't do anything to her. It's just where she was. It's just that it was in front of her as this happened. It's just, that's all it takes. But she has to use the bathroom, and she goes in and realizes that she's gotten her period for the first time. And there's nobody in there with her, and she doesn't know what she needs to do. So she wads up a bunch of toilet paper and puts it in her underwear, and she opens the door, and there is a man standing right there, and he is a gray, and she goes through him, which she hates. And then she feels him brush the small of her back. This is a touch, which has never happened before. And then he begins to try and pull her shorts down. And he is trying to rape her. Now, I think that it was the blood that triggered this somehow. I don't know if this, I don't know if this is something that she has had to deal with every time she's had her period. And that's why it's always if it's always worse around her period, or if because the mention of the blood gets such a reaction when Darlington says that's going to be happening at this ritual. And it felt to me like she is aware blood is a factor, but didn't quite get that was what was going on necessarily, and is realizing like the increased danger, perhaps. And I'm thinking maybe it's only danger to her. Like, it doesn't seem like the blood, they deal with rituals that have blood. They deal with the grays the exact same way Lethe does. It doesn't seem to really, all it does is like, I'm going to expect more grays because they get more drawn in when there is blood involved. But it does not seem like the grays somehow act differently, have different abilities, anything like that. So obviously her ability to see them the way that she does, it feels like results in a different effect. And I just do not know how this could work. And she is like on the floor as this invisible man is trying to rape her when the teacher and her friend come back into the bathroom. And they can't see him, so it just looks like she's writhing around by herself on the floor with blood. And it's so like unnerving to this girl Megan that she doesn't want to be friends anymore. And not only that, but Megan tells everybody. And this is the kind of thing where I would like to say I wouldn't tell people if I were Megan. I don't know if I was a kid, if I would really get what could happen to Alex as a result of this getting around. I may have told a couple people, but I don't think that I had a lot of blabbermouth friends. My friends were pretty like introverted. So I feel like even if I did tell some people, I don't feel like it would really get around. that said, I don't know that. And I would like to think that this incredibly traumatic thing that I saw, even if I didn't understand what was going on and how traumatic it was, I would see there was something awful. And I would not spread this rumor. But she starts getting like bullied for it and gets like pasta sauce smeared on her locker, and people call her Bloody Mary. And her mother gets a phone call, and she overhears her mother talking about how they think she may have been molested, that she's acting out now because of it. I don't know. There was a swim coach at the Y. He always seemed a little off, and Alex didn't like going to the pool. Maybe something happened. And there's a part of me that really appreciated that her mother is giving credence to this theory, because a lot of parents react as if there were something going on with my child, I would know. Nobody would have I keep such a close eye. And that's simply not possible. You do your best, but predators know how to get around the fucking barriers you put up. That's the fucking game. And I liked that she was immediately wanting to engage her daughter and be like, will you talk to me about what's happening? But understandably, because nobody has believed Alex this whole time about what she sees, she already has some deep resentment about this. Tell me what happened. What is she supposed to say? And also is aware her mother can't help. Her mother can't see them. Her mother won't know what to do. There's nothing to protect her. And she says, I can't go back to school. And her mother keeps being like, you have to. And when she tries to hug her, Alex screams, kicks at her mom to keep her away, and screams, you're a fucking loser, over and over, until her mother starts crying again. And Alex locks herself in her room. And this begins the spiral. She is brought to a therapist. She won't talk to her. She eventually goes back to school because that's the ultimatum she's given. She is left completely by herself. Nobody wants to talk to her. Nobody wants to deal with her. She tries explaining everything to Megan. And of course, Megan just is like, oh, okay, sure. Leaves, tells everyone again. And this is when this other girl asks to meet her at that Tres Muchachos restaurant and does not show up. And this is when she meets a woman, at this point, a girl named Mosh. And these are the kids that are the outliers. They are the neglected ones, and they are the ones that do drugs and skip class and, and this is not necessarily indicative of that you will be a loser for the rest of your life. I've known plenty of people that pulled this shit, and they managed to pull things together and live a decent life. But usually if you're able to get away with a lot of this, it means that there's nobody looking out for you. And that is not great. That's a difficult place to operate from. So this is when she meets Mosh's boyfriend. And this is Len, who is a bit of a creep with her initially, says something about how pretty she is, even though he's older enough that it's you know how that age is. A few years is a big difference in age. And they smoke weed, and she's seen people smoke weed enough to know how to do it. So she does it, and then realizes that ever since she took a toke, there are no dead things around. And it is the gateway to her realizing that she can get away for a little while if she's on something. And I had said, I'm sure she uses drugs as a way to escape what she sees, but I didn't realize how literal it was, that if she were stoned on something, that she just didn't see them. I thought it made it somehow easier to bear. And it turns out it doesn't always even make it easier to bear. There are certain drugs that make it worse. There was Molly, which apparently she could feel all of their emotions and their despair and everything. But the thing that had happened in the bathroom never happens again. None of them are able to touch her again. And she doesn't know why. And they're still all over. So she's enjoying, first of all, the relief of not seeing them. Second of all, everyone around her is always stoned. So if she starts to freak out because she sees something, they do not care. They do not like mock her or think she's a weirdo. They just find it funny because they assume it's an effect of the drugs, which they think is amusing. And then Alex got held back a year. She got suspended. She took cash from her mom's purse, then little things from around the house. Finally, her grandfather's silver kiddush cup. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Mira cried and shouted and set new house rules. Alex broke them all. Felt guilty for making her mom sad. Felt furious at feeling guilty. It all made her tired, so eventually she stopped coming home. When Alex turned 15, her mother used the last of her savings to try to send her to a scared straight rehab for troubled teens. By then, Mosh was long gone, off to art school, and she didn't hang with Alex or Len or any of the other kids when she came home for the holidays. Alex had run into her at the beauty supply, still buying black hair dye. Mosh asked how school was, and when Alex just laughed, Mosh had started to offer her an apology. "What are you talking about?" Alex said. "You saved me." Mosh had looked so sad and ashamed that Alex practically ran out of the store. And she goes home, and here are these dudes to drag her off. And they put zip ties around her wrists, and she has been taught how to get out of them by Len. And escapes, goes to Baskin-Robbins where he works, and they get stoned and have sex. And it's just kind of a series of horribler events like this over and over again. There is a moment, this whole thing with the fact that like Mosh kind of shaped up and felt guilty for influencing what happened to Alex. I really wonder what that must feel like, because, you know, it's not everyone who would have the self-awareness and take responsibility for their role in getting somebody hooked on using or just bringing them down a path where they don't take responsibility for anything. And granted, Alex's situation is very special, and Mosh doesn't really get that at all. So she's taking responsibility for more than she should. Nevertheless, though, I appreciate that about her. And I hate that it just made Alex feel worse. But I like that Mosh can see, if this were a regular person who didn't have this ability, that she had played a part, you know, because she did. And it's not necessarily her fault, in quotes, but you know, it's not nothing either. And she like does these occasional stints of trying to get clean, and then she would see something particularly awful and she disappears into the drugs again. And then she goes on that way until Helly, the golden girl Len had expected her to hate, maybe hoped she would, the girl she loved instead. And I am really curious whether that's like a love that's platonic or romantic, because there's been, you know, she had sex with Len, so it's not like that she's gay necessarily, although she was stoned, and I don't know if that influences you to do something you wouldn't otherwise, but I wouldn't be surprised if one of your first sexual experiences as a kid is being assaulted, that maybe you want to avoid dudes in general, even if that was a dead dude. So this whole thing, with Sandow showing up and the explanation of everything to her, I just really felt for her and how frustrating it is to know, how kind of horrifying it is. Frustrating is not a dramatic enough word. That maybe they could have taught her something that kept her from being assaulted. And that would have been it. That would be all they'd need to have done, and it would have changed everything. She went down the road she did to get away, unsuccessfully in some ways, but it did work in pretty significant ways, so you can't blame her for leaning into it. So anyway, she asks Dawes at this point to go with her to the morgue to see Tara Hutchins' body. And she can't even articulate to herself what it is that is bothering her about Tara's death. But there is something about the scene, and she's still unable to zero in on it. And I can't tell, that felt wrong and felt weirdly familiar is also the vibe. It's ringing a bell for her, and it's out of reach. So she wants to go see the body, which is not really supposed to be part of what she does. And Dawes agrees to go, but under protest. So they take Darlington's car to the morgue. And I really enjoy getting to see Alex use her conning skills a little bit, because what she does is convince the woman at the desk that she is Tara's cousin. And even though this woman is certainly wary because Tara's news and people are weirdos, and she manages to focus on how this woman is wearing a cross and say things of religious tone about why she wants to see her cousin again, and get this woman to trust her a little based on that, and talks about prayer. And when the woman says I have to get in touch with the detective, she pulls out her phone and calls him and hands the phone over and is certain he's not going to answer. She texts him to pick up before making the call because she knows he's that contrarian that he won't answer now. And so this woman leaves a message, and she sort of manages to be well, is that enough? Can I see her after all? So she's allowed down, but she would have had to use photo ID, except that she has one more coin of compulsion left. Uses that to get past the necessity of ID. And she goes down there, and we find out that Tara had a lot of tattoos on her body. And she's wondering to herself if she died, whether her tattoos would just appear. And that's a pretty good question. I'm assuming they do, but I don't know. And she does this spell, and there is a map hovering above the body that is a smoky reflection of the pain that this woman has experienced. And Alex can draw her hand through this smoke and gets pulled into the scene of whatever it was that happened to her. And she gets pulled into the scene of this boy, Lance, who is looking down on her. She's on the ground. Sometimes she loved him, but lately the thought left her. She felt herself open her mouth, tasted something acrid on her tongue. Lance was smiling. They were on their way. Where? She felt only excitement, anticipation, the world beginning to blur. "I'm sorry," Lance said. She could hear something like a boot squelching in mud. And then she realizes it's him using a saw the knife, but it says the blade sawed away. Why didn't she feel it? "Close your eyes," said an unfamiliar voice. She did, and was gone. And Alex comes back to herself and is I have taken a lot of drugs. There is nothing that would keep you from being able to feel somebody stabbing you into the chest so hard that your sternum collapses. There is nothing. What the fuck? And she saw Lance's face, and she knows he was definitely part of it. So he has been arrested, and that's certainly part of the thing, but it's not everything. There was a third person there. We don't know who it was. Apparently Tara didn't even see him, doesn't recognize him herself. So this whole thing is just so like, it gives you just a little info, but not enough. And she goes to leave, and here is Detective Turner, and he is real mad. Meanwhile, the coroner, he's still under the compulsion spell. So he's just as like compliant as can be. And it's just like, do you need me to do anything? I'll just chill over here. And this is when she starts to like get in Turner's face a little bit more. And she says, I'm not doing this for fun. Do you get that? I don't like being Dante. You don't like being Centurion. But these are our jobs, and you're screwing it up for both of us. And he's sort of like seems taken off guard, because that's true. She's right. And he says her boyfriend was arrested near the scene. Their neighbors had heard arguments over the last few weeks. There's blood evidence. He had hallucinogens in his system. And she's like, what? What was he taking? What was she on? And then Turner says, do you want him to get away with it? Because you're tampering with a corpse. And if you fuck around enough, he's going to be able to walk away. And that will be your fault. And he needs to go down for this. And she's like, oh, no, yeah. 100% he needs to go down for this. And then she says, just give me a name. Anybody that might be potentially involved. And he says there was only one society name in her contacts, Trip Helmuth, the glossy, expensive boy who knew he would be just fine. And he is like, he has what could be an alibi because he was working the door at the prognostication, but people went inside and didn't come out for a long time. So it's certainly possible that he could have left. It's just not necessarily possible that he could have gotten all the way across campus and back and nobody would notice. And Turner says, do not talk to him. I'll send you and the dean the info once we lock in his alibi. Next time I find you anywhere you're not supposed to be, I'll arrest you on the spot. And she just starts laughing in his face. You're not going to arrest me, Detective Turner. The last place you want me is in a police station making noise. I'm messy, and Lethe is messy, and all you want is to get through this without our mess getting on those expensive shoes. I don't know how you ended up here, Ms. Stern, but I know the difference between quality goods and what I find on the bottom of my shoe, and you are most definitely not quality. She gave him her sweetest, warmest smile. Don't grab me like that again. I may be shit, but I'm the kind that sticks. And that is the end of chapter 8, and I had to stop. You guys, it's killing me. It's absolutely killing me. Thank you, Joanna, very much for booking a lot of these episodes pretty close together so that I don't have to suffer too terribly, because it's agony. Oh my God. Really, I'm loving this. This is so fascinating. I am dying to know what we're doing. Okay. I have to wrap it up, but I don't even have any further theories. I am honestly, the one thing I'll say that I'm really looking forward to, I am eager for the moment that Darlington understands a little bit more about how little he understands about the Greys. I am looking forward to anything that might prove some of what Alex has been trying to tell him is correct, or just in general that she has an experience that's very different based on the source of her ability. He has to drink a drug, and she doesn't. And she can see them in color, and he can't. Clearly, they are not operating on the same thing here. So that's what I'm sort of like most eager for, because I feel like it's the nearest to... I don't expect to find out what happened to Darlington before I get to see that scene. I feel like whatever happened to him might be a result of him finding some shit out because he fucked around. But also I do look forward to finding out what happened to him. Tara, I'm also curious, but it's not as like immediate for me. So yeah. All right. I'm going to wrap up, but thank you guys again so much for listening. Thank you to Joanna again for commissioning, and I will see you soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.